This week is a big moment in relations between the two superpowers, with Donald Trump in China to meet his counterpart Xi Jinping. It's the first trip by US president since Trump went the last time almost 9 years ago. Just think about how much has changed since then, how much tension has built up. We've had COVID and wars and trade wars and threats to Taiwan, and China all along getting steadily more powerful. Many fear that these two giants are destined somehow for a showdown. And yet, right now, there's a sense that the two sides are keen on keeping things steady. So, in this video, we're going to ask, what does Donald Trump actually want out of this visit? What does Xi Jinping want? And as Trump himself might put it, who actually has the cards to get what they want? Well, Matt Turpin is going to help us break all of this down. He served in Donald Trump's first term as the China director in the National Security Council, so he knows Trump's thinking on China very well indeed. And now he's a think tanker and a senior advisor at the defense tech firm Palantir. So, Matt, thanks a lot for speaking to us today. A huge week, obviously. Let's start at the beginning, like really with the the baseline. What does your old boss want out of this visit?
I think his primary focus is on trade and investment. That has been the centerpiece of how he views international relations, and particularly the sort of the problem he sees that the United States has in its relationship with China is that fundamentally we have sort of an unbalanced and unequal economic relationship. The United States has a persistent trade deficit with China, and he wants to fix that.
So we've seen, so trade and investment, we've had a flavor of that over the first year and a bit of the second Trump administration, haven't we? Let's turn it back to Xi then. So what does he want? What are his priorities out of this meeting?
I think he would also like to address some of the issues in the trade and investment space. I mean, the United States has placed significant tariffs on Chinese imports. The Chinese economy is very dependent upon, its exports, and that has only increased over the past, since the end of COVID, and that you've got a Chinese leader that would like to resolve the issues of being able to have better access to the world's largest and wealthiest consumer market. So
if we put trade and investment in the heart of this, let's go through a little bit blow by blow about what each side, if those are the things that they want, what they may be able to achieve. So if we're looking at Trump's point of view, there's been a lot of talk about kind of potential sort of low-hanging fruit, so deals that Trump can come out with after these talks and say, we've got a huge sale of soybeans, which is great for farming communities in parts of the Midwest, or we've got a great big sale of Boeing aircraft.
I mean, I think those would be sort of the basic things that he would expect to be able to get from this, that fundamentally Xi Jinping has held out approval on these kinds of purchases, expecting that these are the kinds of things that will be negotiated in a face-to-face meeting.
What kind of things would Xi Jinping, if we flip it back to him, if he would see that as a win for Trump, so what would Xi want in return for that kind of level of a deal?
I think he would like to see, a lifting of tariffs on Chinese goods being sold into the United States. Right now, we're sitting at about 40 to 50% baseline tariff on Chinese goods into the United States. Late last spring, it was somewhere, a year ago, it was, had gone up to around 140%. It's now dropped down to this sort of 50 to 45%. And that, of course, is an area for a deal and for a transaction to take place.
I mean, there's also talk about setting up something like what they're talking about, a board of trade, and also separately, potentially a board of investment. Can you explain, the Americans have been briefing about this, like what could a board of trade be? What is that?
Fundamentally, the Chinese economy is organized in a very statist, interventionist sort of manner. We would prefer to have our economy organized in such a way in which our commercial entities, sort of act and are able to pursue their own interests for their own profit. And that the government plays a referee role from sort of a rule system. But of course, that's not the way Beijing wants to do this. They want to participate on the playing field with their companies. And so therefore, the United States feels that it probably needs to conduct managed trade instead of free trade as a way to be able to sort of resolve these differences.
But yeah, I mean, what you're describing there, it does sound pretty kind of basic, right? So, I mean, Donald Trump sort of thinking, okay, I'll sell a bunch of soybeans and a bunch of Boeings, and then I'll let the Chinese sell a bit more stuff a bit more easily into the US. This doesn't really get at any of the sort of structural issues in the relationship between China and the US, does it? It just feels like a kind of like a visit to the market, right?
Yeah, this is the fundamental shift from sort of where we've been in the past. And even during the first the first Trump administration. I think there's increasingly a realization inside the United States that we are not going to be able to persuade Beijing to adopt the kind of market economy system that we prefer, right? And therefore, this idea of holding out negotiations for them to make structural reforms is simply probably not a good way to go.
There's another level of asks that have been anticipated from Xi Jinping relating to Taiwan, specifically that he is keen to get Donald Trump to kind of soften the US language around its views of the status of Taiwan. For instance, to go from saying that the United States does not support or does not actively support the independence of Taiwan to saying rather that it actually opposes it, which may sound like splitting hairs to some, but in the fineries of the diplomacy around Taiwan would be a pretty big deal. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think it's important to get into what Xi wants. I think one of the things before we touch that is, so what is it that sort of Donald Trump ultimately wants, right? I mean, he wants more balanced trade between the United States and China, right? That you don't have a deficit anymore. And I suspect that what he would really want is that the United States sells more to China than China sells to the United States.
Yeah.
That is unlikely to happen within the next decade or two. Certainly will not happen in the next 3 years. And so I just want to place that is for President Trump, that is sort of the top thing that he wants, right? And so when we talk about Taiwan, I suspect that is the top thing that Xi Jinping wants. And it would appear to me that China simply cannot achieve the things that Donald Trump wants. And so I'm somewhat skeptical about whether or not Donald Trump will agree to all of the things that Xi Jinping would want on his priority area.
Basically what you're laying out is that, so Xi Jinping might be thinking, okay, get Trump to change the language on Taiwan, soften the language on Taiwan, but the quid pro quo for that would be balanced trade, something that even if she wanted it, it would be hard to deliver.
Change in the way in which this is, which, I mean, fundamentally, it is. I think it's pretty clear that Beijing is simply unwilling to even contemplate those changes because it fundamentally undermines the way in which the party operates and its control over the economy. And so that to me sets up it. I think it's absolutely true that these leaders want certain things and will seek to persuade the other of this. It seems to me unlikely that those things are going to turn out as they would want because they're going to run into sort of very strong desires on both sides to avoid negotiating on those things.
Donald Trump is definitely famously not a details guy. I mean, do you think he is highly attuned to the value of this kind of diplomatic language around Taiwan? If Xi is trying to ask him for this, presumably playing it down, do you think that Trump would understand diplomatically what a big kind of gift this would be if he went down this road?
I mean, I think he certainly has advisors that are fully aware of that. And I think Donald Trump has heard this on a number of occasions from Xi Jinping. This isn't the first time the two of them interacted, and it won't be the first time that Xi Jinping has brought up Taiwan. And so I suspect that the president understands that Taiwan is a very high priority for Xi Jinping, and the president will understand that Xi Jinping seems to be unwilling to do the things that Donald Trump thinks are his highest priority. And that there is a long history of China being unwilling to either follow through on commitments they've made in the areas that Donald Trump really cares about.
So you would be surprised if Trump does say anything to change the U.S. policy or position. You would be surprised.
I suspect he will make some statement about it, but I don't think it actually changes the sort of the material position that the United States is in. I will remind folks that the United States just conducted So the largest Bala-Katan exercise in the Philippines included Japan for the very first time just last week. So in the run-up to this summit, the United States is testing cruise missiles that can do anti-ship launching that are being fired out into the South China Sea. It's testing unmanned surface vessels that can sink ships. So there are sort of two messages being sent, right?
And on arms sales, I mean, it's also obviously very well known that the Chinese would like the Americans to stop selling arms to the Taiwanese, but there was a very big, the largest ever, I think, arms sale towards the end of last year. But it's gone quiet since then. You would also, I take it, then be surprised to see Trump saying anything that would indicate, a slow-rolling future arms sales to Taiwan.
I mean, Donald Trump also likes to sell arms to U.S. partners and allies. So I would remind everyone that just last week, Taiwan finally kind of worked through a deal on its own special defense budget. It was a little less than half of what the Lai administration had asked for, but I think three or four times as high as the position that the opposition party, the KMT, had in the legislative yuan. And so we have we have a fairly sizable special defense budget that has just been approved. That obviously was a big part of whether or not the United States could consider another arms sale package, was whether or not the Taiwanese government would actually fund another arms sale package.
Let's get back to this idea of kind of cards, like who has what cards to play. The US did get a taste of some pretty major cards that the Chinese at least currently have to play last year in terms of rare earths, that the Chinese imposing restrictions on the export of rare earths certainly got American attention. It certainly got a lot of European attention too, as a major card to play. And the Americans are trying to counteract that now with getting more sources of rare earths. But it will be there now for pretty much any American administration as a major factor that they kind of have to deal with now. That China has serious leverage, serious cards to play.
Well, I mean, we all probably should have learned that lesson in 2010 and 2011 when China used this exact same card on Japan over a dust-up over the Senkaku Islands. And obviously that is when we all should have learned this lesson and we should have resolved these issues. We now see the Chinese government using these again. They started developing these tools in 2023 and 2024 in response to the October 7th, 2022 export controls on advanced semiconductors. And so we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. These are vulnerabilities we knew were there. We did not have the political will to begin to solve them, nor did, between inside the United States or between the United States and its allies. It looks like that's starting to come together now. My other area of deep concern is in sort of small molecule pharmaceuticals, those sorts of pharmaceutical precursors that go into all kinds of drugs that we use on a day-to-day basis. China dominates that. That is something that I'm very deeply concerned about being used during a conflict as leverage to get us to back down. And we should be seeking to resolve that vulnerability as well.
But it often takes a crisis to kind of wake countries up, doesn't it? Let's talk about the Iran war. Obviously, this is a major backdrop. This is one reason, the reason why this trip was actually initially delayed. This is going on. This obviously affects America's standing in the world. There's been a lot of talk about how China, this is kind of the blowback from the Iran war has helped China sort of puff up its soft power image around the world. But in terms of, concrete issues between the US and China, the US State Department, this was just recently announced, has sanctioned 3 Chinese entities, was the announcement, for providing satellite imagery to Iran during the war. The administration's been quite quiet on this. Is Trump simply trying to not rock the boat? Why is he not breathing fire and fury about this supposed infraction by these Chinese players?
Well, I mean, it's obviously not quiet. They announced it publicly. The president has spoken on this publicly. And the U.S. government is placing sanctions on these companies to get them to stop doing it and impose costs, and doing it publicly. So I guess I would look at it the other way, as we've discovered that the Chinese government is providing material support to an adversary who has been seeking to target and kill America's service members, as well as civilians in the Gulf states.
Pretty much everything that we've gone through, at least at this point, it doesn't necessarily look like either side coming out with some huge win at the expense of the other. That's the nature of, I guess, the two great powers where their power is equalizing, where China's power has very nearly equaled that of the United States. But let's frame it a little bit in kind of Xi Jinping language. He often talks, and the Chinese often talk about win-win cooperation. So are there any areas where the wins would be more equally shared, where you might see some progress? And I think there are two areas where there's been some conversation, and one is a dialogue on AI, and another is dialogue about nuclear arms control. With the disappearance of New START between the US and Russia, and with China's nuclear arsenal expanding very rapidly now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing some signals that there may be a willingness to talk about, what is the criteria that both countries will exercise on review of AI models before they're sort of released into the wild, right? And what are the sort of the basic things that both sides will do? So you might see some alignment there. So I think that's possible. On the nuclear sort of nuclear arms negotiations. Of course, Donald Trump during the first administration, brought this up and very strongly pushed forward that any sort of negotiations with Russia over a next version of an arms control treaty had to include China as well, right? That China was just as much of a power in this, and since it was following a nuclear breakout of its own, has been doing so for the last several years, that the United States had to include China in this. I think the Chinese have been quite clear that until they reach parity or beyond, they are not interested into those negotiations, because they would see themselves as sort of negotiating themselves into a lesser position. And so I'm not optimistic it'll happen, but I suspect the United States will continue to push for it, because it's very much in our interest to include China inside any sort of future arms control or arms limitation sort of agreement.
But of course, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping at the last summit that they had did have an agreement about keeping to the kind of the nexus of these two last issues, AI and nuclear weapons, an agreement to keep AI out of nuclear command and control. So
seems to me like a no-brainer, right? I mean, I don't think either country is like rushing to have AI determine whether or not you launch nuclear weapons. Right. I mean, it seems if you're gonna have AI do anything, you offload other tasks before you offload like the most important thing a leader would have to worry about. Right. So it seems it's a low bar. Right. I don't think anyone was actually thinking about doing that.
What kind of a world we're going into? And there are two kind of camps. There's the multipolar camp, the we're moving to a world of multiple poles of power. And then there are others who say the structural competition between the US and China is so overpowering that it creates pretty much a bipolar world. Where do you sit?
I mean, I think we sit in a new Cold War. We've got two clear dominant powers. Sort of everyone else is kind of a middle power or lower. But just like we had during the first Cold War, there is an aspect of multipolarity, right? I mean, we had a non-aligned movement during the first Cold War, right, of Indonesia and India and various other countries signing on to doing it. We certainly, the United States certainly didn't have full control over the decision-making in foreign policy and economic policy of all of its allies. Japan and Germany both pursued their own sort of approaches to the Soviet Union. So I think that, it is more of the same, right? I mean, we have a deep hostile rivalry between the two great powers. And then you have a variety of powers that are underneath that see themselves as middle powers, right? So I don't think we're going back to a period of unipolarity. I think we're moving into this sort of bipolar, multipolar mix in which multiple powers are competing, but there are clearly two sort of dominant camps.
And the next taste of how this world is developing comes this very week. Thanks a lot, Matt.